The September wind carried the smell of poverty through the cracks in the board walls. Henrik Nordstrom woke to his daughter shivering, her 9-year-old frame curled tight under a blanket, too thin for Colorado mountain mornings. The cabin they rented for $8 a month leaked cold like a sieve leaked water, and he'd spent the last hour before dawn calculating how many more weeks the $42 in his pocket could sustain them. Emma stirred eyes opening to find him already awake. She never asked anymore if things would get better. The question had died with her mother 2 years back, buried alongside the infant son who'd taken Sarah with him into whatever darkness waited beyond birth. Emma had learned silence the way other children learned multiplication tables, and Henrik hated himself for teaching her that particular lesson. The knock came as he was trying to coax heat from a wood stove that had given up pretending to care. A boy from town, no older than Emma, thrust an envelope at him with the urgency of someone paid a nickel for speed. The law firm's name embossed across the top meant nothing good in Henrik's experience. Lawyers didn't write to broke architects with condolences or congratulations. He tore the seal with fingers still stiff from cold. The words swam into focus slowly as if his brain refused to process their meaning. Estate of Diego Chavez, bequeaths to Henrik Nordstrom, 160 acres Stone Mesa, New Mexico territory, ancient ruins and all structures thereon. Diego. The name hit him like a fist to the solar plexus. 3 months since the telegram had arrived announcing the old man's death from lung fever, 3 months since Henrik had stared at the message, knowing he couldn't afford the train fare to Santa Fe for the funeral. Diego Chavez, who taught him everything that mattered about building, who'd been more father than his own blood, father had managed in 37 years. Dead and buried while Henrik had been too poor to say goodbye. Emma was reading over his shoulder, her breath warm against his arm. The child could read better than most adults, another gift from Sarah, who'd been a school teacher before marriage and motherhood had claimed her. A second page slipped from the envelope, Diego's handwriting immediately recognizable in its careful precision. Henrik's throat tightened as he read the Spanish-inflected English that had narrated so many lessons over their years together. Henrik mi hijo, you were the son I never had. The ruins hold more than stones. Follow the old ways. Build what I could not. The truth is in the foundation. Coordinates 36.8547 degrees N, 106.2891 degree W, 12 feet down south wall. Trust the thermal mass. Emma's whisper barely reached him. What does that mean? He started to answer, but another knock shattered the moment. This visitor didn't wait for invitation. The door swung inward to reveal a man whose clothes cost more than Henrik's entire year of living, wool suit pressed sharp enough to cut boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the cabin's squalor back at itself. Victor Hartwell, land acquisitions for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The introduction came smooth as oil on water, and Henrik's skin crawled with the instinctive knowledge that this man had practiced his smile in mirrors until it looked almost human. The offer came fast, $500 cash for property Henrik had owned for exactly 90 seconds. Victor's confidence suggested he already knew about the inheritance, which meant he'd been watching the law firm's correspondence. That alone told Henrik everything he needed to know about the railroad's methods. How did you know I just received the letter an hour ago? Victor's smile widened without reaching his eyes. I make it my business to know. The property is worthless. Ancient ruins, no water, hostile terrain. Diego Chavez spent 40 years squatting on that land. He died a poor man. Don't make his mistakes. Emma's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. Diego wasn't poor. He was happy. Victor's gaze dropped to the child and something cold moved behind his expression. Happiness doesn't feed children, little girl. Your father knows that. He's a practical man, aren't you, Mr. Nordstrom? The envelope Victor dropped on the table held more cash than Henrik had seen in 2 years. $500, final offer. The words hung in the air like a noose waiting for a neck. We're keeping the property. Victor's face hardened into something ugly and honest. You have 1 week to reconsider. After that, the railroad takes what it needs. Men who stand in the way of progress tend to find themselves moved along one way or another. The threat wasn't subtle. Henrik had heard stories about railroad expansion, about homesteaders who'd refused to sell, finding their wells poisoned, their livestock dead, their crops burned. Accidents, all of them. Terrible luck. The door closed behind Victor with a gentleness that felt more menacing than a slam. Emma's hand found Henrik's, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. We're really keeping it. Even though he's scary, the question deserved better than platitudes. Henrik knelt until his eyes were level with hers, seeing Sarah's features reflected in their daughter's face. Sarah's steel in the set of her jaw. Diego trusted me with something. I don't know what yet, but he didn't leave me ruins for no reason. And I won't let that man frighten us into throwing away what might be our only chance at something better than this. He gestured at the cabin's decay, at the poverty that clung to them like a second skin. Emma nodded once sharp and decisive, and Henrik recognized Diego's stubbornness in the gesture. The old man's influence had reached farther than either of them had known. The train to New Mexico cost them $18 they couldn't afford. Emma pressed her face to the window as Colorado gave way to New Mexico territory, her breath fogging the glass as she sketched buildings in the condensation with one finger. She'd inherited her father's eye for structure, could spot load-bearing elements and architectural flourishes with a glance that took most adults years to develop. A fellow passenger, weathered face suggesting decades of frontier living, leaned across the aisle when he overheard their destination, Stone Mesa. Nothing there but old Indian ruins, haunted, some say. His laugh held no humor. Railroad wants that route bad. Anyone in their way tends to move along, if you catch my meaning. Henrik caught his meaning perfectly. We're not moving. The man shrugged a gesture that said he'd delivered his warning and washed his hands of whatever came next. Suit yourself. Just don't say nobody told you. Stone Mesa revealed itself as the wagon crested the final rise, a settlement too ambitious to call a camp and too rough to call a town. 12 families scattered across high desert that stretched toward mountains purple with distance. The altitude pressed against Henrik's chest, 6,800 feet, according to the driver who charged them $3 for the ride from the rail station. 2 miles from what passed for a town center, the ruins rose from the earth like bones breaking through skin. The Pueblo wall stood south-facing 18 to 20 feet of hand-laid stone and adobe 7 to 8 feet high, where it survived 24 to 30 inches thick, where Henrik could measure its depth. The craftsmanship stole his breath. These builders had understood principles that modern architects were only beginning to rediscover. Emma's description caught it perfectly. It's like a castle that sank into the ground. Henrik's trained eye saw what she meant. The visible wall represented only a fraction of the original structure. Outlines traced themselves across the earth where rooms had been buried, deliberately covered by someone who'd wanted to hide rather than destroy. The positioning screamed intentionality. South-southeast orientation to catch winter sun, thermal mass sufficient to moderate temperature swings, wind protection from the mesa's bulk behind it. Whoever had built this had been a master. Diego's small adobe hut crouched 50 yards from the ruins, humble and precise in equal measure. The door swung open on leather hinges that needed no oil. Inside, tools hung in careful arrangement, each piece cleaned and maintained with the devotion Diego had brought to everything he touched. His workbench held drawings, architectural sketches of the ruins rendered with the precision of a man who'd spent decades studying every stone. Emma found the loose floorboard before Henrik thought to look. The metal box underneath had been placed recently, the disturbed earth still loose around its edges. Inside lay Diego's journal pages filled with Spanish and English in alternating bursts, a detailed survey map, 3 iron keys of different sizes, and a photograph that made Henrik's hands shake. Diego, as a young man, maybe 25, standing beside a Pueblo elder whose face held the kind of wisdom that transcended culture or language. The date on the back read 1850, which made the photo impossibly old and therefore impossibly precious. But the note accompanying it mattered more than the image itself. Henrik, the chamber is sealed. 3 locks, 3 truths. The keys open nothing until you understand what the ancients built. Start with the south wall. Build as I taught you. The stones will show you. What chamber? Emma's question pulled him from the note. She was already moving toward the door, instinct or luck, guiding her to the cliff face behind the hut. The stone door had been integrated so perfectly into the natural rock that Henrik would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing. But Emma's 9-year-old eyes, unburdened by adult assumptions, saw the seam where human work met nature's chaos. 3 heavy iron locks recently installed, if the metal's lack of rust meant anything, secured the door against intrusion. Emma tried each key in sequence, frowning when none of them fit the mechanisms. They don't fit yet, Daddy. What do you mean yet? She held up Diego's note, pointing to the critical phrase. Until you understand, we have to learn something first. The wisdom in her observation humbled him. Diego had designed a puzzle that required knowledge rather than forced understanding, rather than mere possession of keys. Whatever lay behind that door would remain sealed until Henrik proved himself worthy of the revelation. Sunset brought visitors. Thomas Brennan arrived first, 35 years old and carrying the weight of a man with too many responsibilities and too few solutions. His nervousness manifested in hands that wouldn't stay still, fingers drumming against his thighs as he delivered his warning. Mr. Nordstrom, I'm supposed to tell you that Mr. Hartwell is offering work to anyone who helps convince you to sell. Good money. Times are hard. The pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before Thomas continued. Are you here to threaten me? No. I'm here to warn you. Half the men in town work for Hartwell. The other half are scared of him. My wife Mary is sick. Lung condition. I need the money he's offering. But Diego was a good man. He taught me carpentry when I was a boy. I owe him. The internal conflict played across Thomas's face like storm clouds racing toward collision. Whatever's on this land, Hartwell wants it bad enough to hurt people for it. Elena Martinez arrived before Henrik could respond, 26 years old, and carrying herself with the authority of someone who'd learned to command respect in a territory that didn't grant it freely to women or Mexicans, much less both. The territorial school teacher had brought evidence, a newspaper clipping yellowed with age but still legible. Pueblo gold, lost treasures of the ancient ones. The article speculated about wealth hidden in sealed chambers, about conquistador plunder that had been reclaimed and concealed by indigenous survivors. Sensationalist garbage mostly, but the core idea aligned too perfectly with Victor Hartwell's desperation to be pure coincidence. You think there's treasure? Henrik heard the skepticism in his own voice. Elena's response came measured and careful. I think Diego thought there was something worth protecting, and I think Hartwell knows what it is. The night air carried cold that promised winter's approach. Henrik and Emma made camp in Diego's hut, the space tight but weatherproof in ways their Colorado rental had never managed. Emma fell asleep quickly, exhausted by travel and transformation. Henrik sat with Diego's journal, reading by lamplight that carved shadows from the darkness. The first entry dated to 1848. Arrived Stone Mesa with Padre Martinez. The Pueblo people were driven out 200 years ago, but their knowledge remains in the stones. 1852 brought revelation. I have found it, the chamber the elder spoke of. Not gold, something more valuable. Proof. 1865 marks sealing. I've sealed the chamber. 3 locks. Only someone who understands the old ways can open it. June 1888, barely 3 months passed. I am dying, lung fever. Henrik is the only one I trust. He has the mind of an architect and the heart of a builder. He will understand what I could not finish. Footsteps outside brought Henrik to his feet, rifle in hand, though he'd never fired at anything more threatening than a coyote. The figure that emerged from darkness wore age like a cloak, 68 years of living, etched into features that spoke of Mexican and Spanish ancestry, braided together across generations. Henrik, Diego told me you would come. Maria Chavez settled by the fire as if she owned the night, and perhaps she did. Diego's widow carried authority earned through 4 decades of surviving beside a man who'd made dangerous knowledge his life's work. Emma woke to the conversation, drawn from sleep by the gravity in Maria's voice. The story came in pieces, carefully arranged to build understanding layer by layer. Diego had spent 40 years studying the ruins, had become obsessed with what the Pueblo people had left behind. Not just buildings, but knowledge. Engineering principles, thermal dynamics, structural mathematics that modern architects thought they'd invented, but were actually rediscovering. The chamber had been found in 1852, sealed deep within the ruins. Inside, Diego had discovered scrolls and artifacts and something else. Something that proved the Pueblo people had possessed advanced understanding of physics and architecture, knowledge the Spanish had tried to destroy during their conquest, knowledge that had been hidden to survive. Frank Hartwell was territorial surveyor in the 1850s. He saw Diego discover the chamber, tried to force him to open it. Diego refused. Maria's voice carried no emotion, just facts delivered with the precision of someone who'd lived with them for decades. Frank searched for 30 years, never found the entrance. Diego hit it perfectly. Now Victor, Frank's son, continues the search. He thinks there's gold. The truth came harder. Diego told me the treasure is wisdom, not wealth. And wisdom is dangerous to powerful men who profit from ignorance. Why didn't Diego open it? Henrik needed to understand the why before he could accept the what. Maria's smile held sadness and pride in equal measure. He did. Once, in 1852. What he saw terrified him. He resealed it immediately. Spent the next 36 years trying to understand what he'd found. She handed Henrik another journal, this one filled with technical drawings and calculations. He said, only someone who can build as the ancients built will understand. Only then is it safe to reveal. The building challenge emerged from Maria's explanation like a key turning in a lock Henrik hadn't known existed. Diego's final request demanded that Henrik construct a cabin using ancient methods against the south wall. The process of building would teach what he needed to know. Only then would the keys work. That's impossible. You can't lock keys with knowledge. Maria's expression suggested she'd expected the objection. Diego was a genius, and he knew the ruin's secrets. The 3 locks aren't normal locks. They're puzzles. Mechanical, yes, but also architectural. You must understand thermal mass wind dynamics, structural integration. Build the cabin. The answers will come. Emma's excitement broke through the tension, like a treasure hunt. Each clue leads to the next. Maria's smile softened. Diego would have liked you, Pequeña. Dawn brought Victor Hartwell and 8 mounted men, the kind of force that announced intentions without requiring words. Frank Hartwell rode at his son's side, 70 years old, and mean as a snake that had learned to enjoy striking. The resemblance between father and son went beyond physical features into something darker, a shared capacity for violence dressed in civilized clothing. So you're the fool who thinks he can squat on Pueblo land. I inherited this land legally. Frank's laugh could have stripped paint. Inheritance from a squatter is still squatting. This land was never properly claimed. It's open to railroad right-of-way. Victor's survey crew began marking the ruins with stakes, preparing to map a route that would require demolishing everything Diego had spent 40 years protecting. Thomas Brennan worked among them, guilt written across his features, but necessity driving his hands. Sorry, Henrik, I need the money. When the crew moved to drill into the south wall for a survey marker, Henrik's architectural training overrode his common sense. Stop. You'll destroy the structural integrity. The explanation poured out before he could reconsider wisdom. The wall was load-bearing, supporting buried structures that would collapse if the keystone elements were compromised. Drilling here risked catastrophic failure. Frank's response came cold and certain. Good. Collapse it. Clear the site. Emma's scream cut across the confrontation like a rifle shot. No. She climbed atop the south wall, 9 years old and defiant, positioned where any attempt to remove her would risk the structural damage Henrik had just warned against. You have to hurt me first. Diego loved these stones. You can't break them. The standoff crystallized around a child's courage. Victor wouldn't order his men to physically remove Emma, not with witnesses present, not with the potential for injury that would turn public opinion against the railroad. Buck Sullivan's arrival shifted the balance further. The blacksmith rode up with the confidence of a man who'd survived worse than frontier bullies and wasn't impressed by their posturing. Frank, you put a hand on that girl and I'll break it. Other townspeople gathered as word spread. Elena Martinez brought documentation proving the ruins' historical significance, demanding territorial approval for any destruction. Victor produced claims of Railroad Commission authorization, but Elena's challenge to show paperwork revealed the bluff. You have 30 days. Then we're coming back with federal marshals. The threat hung in the air after the Hartwells departed. The community remained split, 7 voting to give Henrik his deadline, 5 supporting the railroad's promise of jobs and prosperity. Close enough to feel like defeat masquerading as victory. That night's town meeting at the saloon laid bare the fault lines. Thomas Brennan stood torn between loyalty to Diego's memory and Mary's medical needs. Buck Sullivan argued for preservation and patience. Victor positioned in the back like a spider in its web-painted visions of economic growth that would bypass Stone Mesa if they chose worship of old mud over progress. The deadline started ticking the moment Henrik began laying out the cabin's foundation. Diego's technical notes specified everything: 14 by 8 feet rubble trench, 12 to 16 inches wide, drainage swale cut with 2% fall toward natural runoff. Emma helped measure, her smaller hands steadier than his as she marked distances with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. The carved symbol appeared when Henrik reached 12 feet depth at the south wall's base. Emma spotted it first, a mark that matched Diego's journal exactly. First Truth Foundation. The journal entry clarified, the ancients built deep. 12 feet below grade, the real structure begins. Diego's coordinates finally made sense. They excavated carefully, treating the earth like an archaeological site because that's exactly what it was. The ceramic jar had been sealed with wax and buried with care sufficient to preserve its contents across whatever span of years had passed since placement. Inside, a scroll written in Spanish and Pueblo pictographs revealed its secrets to Henrik's limited translation skills. Diego's notes provided clarity. We who built this place understood warmth is life. The stone remembers the sun's heat. Build with mass, build with knowledge, build with respect. The architectural diagram showed the hidden chamber's entrance, accessible only through correct construction against the ruins' south wall. Each building step would reveal the next clue. The puzzle demanded comprehension, not just labor. When Henrik mixed mud-lime chinking according to Diego's exact recipe, the tiny metal disc emerged from the clay like a gift from the past. Numbers engraved across its surface read 274. Emma's excitement needed no translation. It's a combination for one of the locks, but which lock, and what about the other two? Diego's journal offered guidance without answers. 3 locks, 3 truths. Foundation structure, heat. The community's response to Henrik's building project split along predictable lines. Buck Sullivan provided metalwork without charge, his smithing skills essential for hinges and hardware. Thomas Brennan appeared after dark to help with timber framing, guilt and loyalty warring in his expression as he explained his continued daytime employment with Hartwell. I'm still working for him, but I can help you evenings. The compromise satisfied neither Thomas's conscience nor Mary's needs, but survival demanded ugly accommodations. Elena documented everything for the Territorial Historical Society, her photographs and notes creating a record that might outlast whatever came next. Others mocked openly. Nordstrom's building a shack against old mud while he could have $500 cash. The dropping offer, $400 now $50 less each week, added urgency to ridicule. Week 2 brought structural revelation. When Henrik spaced studs at 24 inches to reduce thermal bridging alignment with the ancient wall's joints triggered a mechanism so subtle he almost missed it. A small panel slid open with a click that sounded like approval. The second scroll's message built on the first. Second truth structure carries force. The wise builder distributes weight. The ancient ones built for centuries. Your locks need understanding. The second combination emerged from calculations. Henrik barely followed mathematical relationships between load distribution and structural harmony that produced the numbers 5 to 1/8. Emma's count reached 2 with the enthusiasm of someone keeping score in a game where the stakes were merely their entire future. Thomas's confession came during roof framing, his voice barely audible over the wind that never stopped moving across the mesa's exposed height. Hartwell hired me to sabotage your build, weaken the frame, make it fail during winter. That's why I took the job with you, to do it from inside. The betrayal should have hurt more than it did. Why are you telling me this? Thomas's tears came hard, the kind that hurt a man's pride but couldn't be stopped. Because I can't do it. Diego taught me to respect good work. And Mary said if I betray Diego's memory, she won't forgive me, even if she dies. The promise Henrik made came from instinct rather than calculation. When we open the chamber, if there's anything of value, you get a share. For Mary's treatment. Diego would have wanted that. Week 3's thermal mass integration required interior clay dung plaster mixed to exact specifications, 1 part clay soil to 1 part sand, 3/4 inch thickness throughout. When afternoon sun heated the ancient wall to its peak temperature, phosphorescent minerals in the mortar began to glow with light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. The hidden text carved into individual stones required that specific wavelength to become visible. El calor revela la verdad. Heat reveals truth. The third scroll appeared in a panel activated by temperature differential, its message completing Diego's puzzle. The stones remember warmth. Build a vestibule to trap heat. Double doors east and west. When winter cold meets solar heat, the final lock opens. The third combination, 396, came with a critical constraint. Use only when cabin is complete and first frost comes. The mechanism requires temperature differential. Victor's escalation during week 3 brought 12 men and legal documents that carried the weight of federal authority, whether genuine or forged. Your time's almost up, Nordstrom. I've filed claim under Homestead Act loopholes. Federal marshal coming in 1 week. Either you sell or you're evicted. The threat of legitimate eviction hit harder than previous intimidation. Victor had lawyers' money and patience to bury Henrik in legal complications that would achieve through paperwork what violence couldn't manage directly. The community rallied when word spread 15 townspeople abandoning their own work to help Henrik complete his cabin before the deadline could bite. Thomas quit Hartwell publicly burning bridges he couldn't afford to burn, but burning them anyway. I'm helping Henrik finish. Women plastered while men framed. Children carried supplies under Elena's organization. The cabin rose against its deadline like a prayer against darkness, each element precisely placed according to Diego's specifications and the ancient wisdom encoded in stone and earth. October 28th brought completion. Henrik stepped back from the finished structure, seeing Diego's vision made manifest in timber and adobe and stone. Perfect integration with the ruined south wall. Thermal mass principles throughout. Airtight chinking, interior plaster. South-facing window. Double-door vestibule oriented east and west for maximum temperature control. Now what Emma's question reflected his own uncertainty. Diego's third scroll had been explicit. Wait for first frost. November 1st delivered exactly that, overnight temperatures dropping to 28 degrees, while afternoon sun heated the south wall surface to 68, 40-degree differential. Enough to trigger whatever mechanism Diego had engineered into his final puzzle. Maria Thomas Buck and Elena gathered as witnesses. Victor watched from distance, his presence a reminder that discovery would bring confrontation. Henrik approached the locked chamber with all 3 combinations, aware that failure meant either he'd misunderstood Diego's teaching or the old man's genius had exceeded even Henrik's estimation. The first lock opened to 274. Foundation truth confirmed. The second lock yielded to 518. Structure truth acknowledged. The third lock clicked at 396 but held firm, mechanism engaged but incomplete. What's wrong? Emma's insight saved them. The vestibule. Open both doors. Cold air flowed through the double-door system, meeting heat radiating from the cabin's interior. The temperature differential inside the third lock's mechanism caused expansion and contraction of precisely calibrated metal components. The final click sounded like victory. The stone door swung inward on counterweights so perfectly balanced that Diego must have spent months engineering the mechanism. The chamber revealed itself in lamplight that turned ancient walls into galleries of knowledge. 10 feet square, carved directly into mesa stone. Walls covered with Pueblo pictographs in Spanish text documenting engineering principles that modern universities taught as recent discoveries. Shelves held pottery tools and scrolls preserved by desert air and deliberate care. The center of the room displayed a large stone tablet covered with calculations and diagrams that Henrik's architectural training let him partially comprehend. It's engineering knowledge. The Pueblo people documented everything: heat transfer, structural loads, water management. This is centuries of accumulated wisdom. Elena's historical perspective added weight to Henrik's observation. This could rewrite what we know about pre-Columbian architecture. Maria's tears spoke to decades of watching Diego protect this knowledge, knowing its value, unable to share its burden until now. Diego knew. This is what he protected. The smaller locked chest at the chamber's rear required only Diego's third key, a simple mechanism after the complexity of the 3-lock puzzle. Gold coins spilled into lamplight, Spanish colonial pieces that represented wealth beyond Henrik's immediate needs. But the land grant document mattered more than gold. Dated 1680, signed by a Spanish governor whose name Elena recognized from historical texts, the document granted Stone Mesa and surrounding territory to the Pueblo people in perpetuity. Legal language that superseded later claims of abandonment or homestead availability. This proves Pueblo ownership. This land was never open for homesteading. The railroad's claim is invalid. So is the territorial government's. Buck's practical concern cut through the legal implications. How much is the gold worth? Maybe $5,000. But the artifacts are priceless, and the knowledge on these walls could change building practices across the territory. Victor's arrival with 20 armed men transformed discovery into siege. I knew it. Diego found something. That chamber belongs to the railroad. Treasure on public land is federal property. The land grant document should have ended the argument. This isn't public land, it's Pueblo land, always was. Frank Hartwell's response reduced law to irrelevance. Doesn't matter. We have guns. You have old paper. Load the gold. We're taking it. Emma's courage exceeded her size. No, this is Diego's. He protected it. The order to take by force had barely left Victor's mouth when hoofbeats announced federal intervention. The marshal arrived with 10 cavalry soldiers, Elena's telegram from days prior finally bearing fruit. Nobody's taking anything until courts decide ownership. This site is now under federal protection pending investigation. The suspension of Victor's railroad claim hit like physical blow. This isn't over. The threat carried more weight for its quiet delivery. That night, temperature dropped to 18 degrees outside Henrik's completed cabin. Inside, 46 degrees of comfort demonstrated every principle Diego had spent 40 years learning to apply. Thomas visited from his own cabin, shivering despite the fire he'd maintained all evening. Your cabin works. It's warmer than mine by 18 degrees. Diego's methods are real. The ancient ones new. We're just relearning. Emma slept warm and safe proof that knowledge could be translated into survival. Henrik studied Diego's photograph in lamplight, seeing the old man's satisfaction in having chosen his heir correctly. Outside, first snow began to fall. Victor watched from the darkness, his father beside him, both men calculating how to take what courts and marshals protected. The chamber was theirs, one way or another. The Blue Norther that would prove everything was still 7 weeks away. The federal marshal established command the morning after the chamber opened, his cavalry turning Stone Mesa into something resembling occupied territory. Henrik found himself required to demonstrate the opening mechanism 3 times for different experts, each examination forcing him to relive the processes that had taken weeks to understand compressed into hours of clinical observation. Sarah Chen arrived from the Smithsonian with equipment that looked more suited to surgery than archaeology. Her examination of the third lock's thermo-mechanical components produced vocabulary. Henrik barely followed phrases about thermal expansion coefficients and precision metalworking that belonged in university lectures rather than New Mexico desert conversations. This is extraordinary. A thermo-mechanical lock from the 1680s. The Pueblo and Spanish collaboration here was far more advanced than we knew. The ownership hearing required Henrik's presence in Santa Fe, a day's travel that meant leaving Emma with Maria and trusting that federal protection would hold against Hartwell ambition. The territorial courtroom smelled of wood polish and corruption, the latter evident in how the judge's gaze slid away from direct eye contact whenever Victor's lawyer spoke. This land was abandoned, open for railroad right-of-way under Territorial Statute 47B regarding indigenous property reversion. Elena's defense delivered pro bono with the passion of someone who understood what history hung in the balance, centered on the land grant document. This paper proves continuous Pueblo ownership. Spanish colonial law recognized indigenous claims. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo preserved existing grants. The judge examined the document with the attention of someone checking for spelling errors rather than legal precedent. This appears authentic, but I need expert verification. Hearing adjourned 60 days pending historical authentication. Victor's smile in the hallway carried the confidence of someone who'd already won. You can't win. I have the railroad's money behind me. Even if you own the land, you can't afford to keep it. Legal fees will bury you. The threat wasn't empty. Henrik's remaining money wouldn't cover another month of living expenses, much less extended legal battles against railroad attorneys who billed by the hour and had infinite hours to bill. Thomas suggested selling gold to pay for defense, but Henrik's conscience balked at liquidating artifacts that belonged to whoever ultimately owned the land. Maria cut through his hesitation with Diego's practicality. He would want you to use it, to protect the knowledge. The compromise came wrapped in debt. Henrik borrowed $5,000 against the gold's value from Stone Mesa's only bank, the loan officer's nervousness suggesting he knew exactly whose displeasure the transaction would earn. The money paid legal fees and bought time, but time bought with borrowed money felt like building a house on sand. November brought community pressure that manifested in economic warfare. Families that had supported Henrik found themselves denied credit at the general store, their children excluded from informal gatherings, their labor rejected for paid work that went to Hartwell supporters instead. The division wasn't along clear moral lines. Good people chose the railroad's promises because their children needed food, and abstract principles about historical preservation couldn't compete with tangible hunger. The town meeting devolved into shouting before Buck Sullivan's massive fist hitting the table restored temporary order. Victor's offer, 50 jobs at good wages if the railroad came through, carried weight that couldn't be dismissed as mere bribery. Stone Mesa had never seen 50 paying jobs at once. That kind of opportunity transformed communities, lifted families, created futures. Or you can have what old mud and tourist gawkers. The counter-argument required Elena's documentation showing tourism revenue potential, her projections of how a protected historical site could generate sustainable income rather than the railroad's temporary construction wages. But projections felt flimsy against Victor's immediate cash theory, against practice, hope, against certainty. Thomas stood during the debate's ugliest moment, his voice cutting through accusations and counter-accusations with confessions' sharp edge. I worked for Hartwell. He promised me $200 for sabotaging Henrik's cabin. The gasps were gratifying, but Thomas wasn't finished. I didn't do it. But that's who you're trusting. A man who bribes sabotage. Victor's denial came smooth as rehearsed testimony. Lies from a desperate man. Buck Sullivan's corroboration changed calculation. Hartwell offered me $100 to accidentally ruin Henrik's foundation work. The blacksmith's reputation for honesty meant his word carried weight that Thomas's couldn't match alone. The meeting ended without resolution, just deeper trenches dug in already divided ground. But Henrik saw the shift. 3 families who'd supported the railroad now reconsidered. Not enough to win, but enough to fight. Private conversation between Victor and Frank Hartwell, overheard by Elena through the saloon's thin walls and reported with journalistic precision, revealed plans that made federal protection seem inadequate. The hearing would take months they didn't have. The chamber needed to disappear. Documents destroyed, evidence eliminated. Marshals can be distracted. Accidents happen. Victor's hesitation lasted only as long as his father's stare. That's destruction of federal evidence. Prison if caught. Only if caught. And I didn't spend 30 years on this to lose to a broke architect and a dead Mexican. The plan's outline emerged from fragments Elena pieced together. Create a distraction in town, infiltrate the site during chaos. Collapse the chamber entrance with carefully placed charges, destroy documents that proved land ownership. Without physical evidence, the case became Henrik's word against the railroad's lawyers, and that was a fight the railroad couldn't lose. Henrik's counter-strategy meant abandoning any pretense of normal life. He moved into the cabin full-time, with Emma positioning themselves within sight of the chamber's entrance. Watch rotation with Thomas and Buck provided coverage when exhaustion demanded sleep, but the vigilance wore at them like water-wearing stone. Diego's journals consumed Henrik's nighttime hours entries from 40 years of study, revealing patterns he'd missed during initial reading. References to winter wisdom appeared throughout, cryptic mentions of blue northers and nature's fury testing what human hands had built. The entry from 1865 crystallized warning into prophecy. The true test comes with the blue norther. Only a cabin built with the ancient knowledge can withstand nature's fury. December's first 2 weeks delivered unseasonably warm weather temperatures, holding between 40 and 45 degrees when they should have dropped below freezing. Henrik used the grace period to document everything inside the chamber, making copies of critical documents, photographing scrolls and artifacts with Elena's camera, in case Victor's destruction plans succeeded. Thomas dedicated every spare moment to improving his own cabin, applying Henrik's teachings with the fervor of someone trying to atone through competence. Chinking went into every gap. Interior plaster-covered walls that had been bare boards. The vestibule addition looked crude compared to Henrik's craftsmanship, but function mattered more than aesthetics. Mary's condition stabilized in the warmer environment, her coughing fits less frequent, her color improving enough that Thomas stopped looking like a man watching his wife die by inches. She visited Henrik's cabin one afternoon, bringing food she couldn't afford and gratitude she couldn't contain. Thomas talks about you constantly. Henrik showed me this. Diego taught him that. He had lost pride in his work. You gave it back. Thomas's modified cabin showed 14-degree improvement over its original performance, interior temperatures reaching 38 degrees during cold snaps that left unmodified structures struggling to maintain 28. Other neighbors noticed. Some asked for help, swallowing pride to admit that maybe the broke architect knew things worth learning. Victor's sabotage attempt came December 12th, execution timed with precision that spoke to military planning. The fire started in the general store just after sunset, flames visible from miles away, every able-bodied person rushing to form bucket brigades before the blaze could spread to adjacent structures. Emma had been watching the chamber from the cabin's window, a duty Henrik had assigned with the seriousness of guard posting. Three men approached through darkness, moving with purpose toward the sealed entrance. She ran faster than 9-year-old legs should manage, lungs burning in cold air, reaching the town center where Henrik worked the bucket line. Mr. Hartwell is in the chamber. He's taking everything. The decision cost seconds. Henrik didn't have. Leaving the fire line meant abandoning the general store, possibly the entire town center, to flames. Staying meant losing whatever evidence Victor could destroy or steal in the time it took to extinguish the blaze. Buck grabbed his arm before the internal debate could paralyze him. Go, I'll handle this. Thomas followed without discussion, both men running toward the chamber through darkness, punctuated by the fire's orange glow behind them. The saboteurs had come prepared with dynamite, the kind of explosives that mining operations used and railroad men had easy access to. Henrik's shout interrupted placement, but couldn't stop the confrontation that followed. The physical fight went badly from its first moment. Henrik was an architect, not a brawler, and the men Victor had hired knew violence the way Henrik knew load-bearing calculations. Fists connected with ribs that cracked audibly. Thomas fought with carpenter's strength, buying time rather than winning, both of them absorbing punishment, while Emma's screams brought the marshal running from town. The cavalry's arrival saved them from worse than broken ribs and split knuckles, but the damage had been done. 3 men arrested dynamite, confiscated evidence of attempted sabotage clear enough that even Victor's lawyers couldn't dismiss it. Frank Hartwell's ranch, raided on the marshal's authority, yielded plans documenting the conspiracy in enough detail to constitute federal charges. Henrik spent that night coughing blood from internal injuries, each breath a negotiation with pain that didn't want to negotiate. Emma's terror manifested as silence, the same silence that had followed Sarah's death, a child's withdrawal from a world that kept threatening to take the people she loved. Daddy, I want to leave. This is too dangerous. The admission costs more than broken ribs. We can't leave. Diego trusted us, but Mama died. I don't want you to die too. Maria's arrival brought the perspective of someone who'd watched Diego face similar threats for 40 years. He never broke. You know why? Because he knew the knowledge mattered more than his safety. Those walls, that wisdom, it could help thousands of people build better, live better. The question escaped before Henrik could reconsider asking. Is it worth dying for Maria's answer came without hesitation. Diego thought so. Elena's discovery 3 days later should have changed everything. The territorial archives in Santa Fe had yielded treasure more valuable than Spanish gold. The land grant document wasn't just authentic, it was protected under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo's specific clause, recognizing existing Spanish land grants to indigenous peoples. Federal treaty law superseded territorial statute. The railroad had zero legal claim. Her excitement upon returning to Stone Mesa died against Henrik's pragmatic question. Then why is the judge delaying? The answer required investigation that confirmed suspicions Elena had harbored since the hearing. Victor's railroad had donated $10,000 to the judge's election campaign. The corruption wasn't subtle once you knew to look for it. Contributions of record in territorial election filings that no one had thought to check. He's bought. He'll rule against us no matter what. Buck's suggestion to appeal reached for solutions that required resources they didn't possess. That takes years, and more money than we have. The mathematics of defeat assembled themselves with brutal clarity. Victor would win through delay, even if he lost on legal merits. Appeals consumed time and money, both commodities Henrik had exhausted. The chamber's knowledge would be buried under legal proceedings until everyone involved had moved on or died. December 14th delivered deceptive warmth, 42 degrees at midday, when historical averages suggested temperatures 20 degrees lower. Henrik sat on his cabin's porch with ribs that hurt less than they had, but still hurt enough to remind him of vulnerability with every breath. Emma pointed to the barometer. Diego had left mercury dropping with speed that suggested atmospheric collapse rather than normal pressure changes. The reading showed 29.72 and falling fast numbers that meant nothing to Emma, but everything to men who'd survived high-altitude winters. Old-timers in town muttered warnings. Storm coming, big one. Buck's Texas drawl added specificity. Blue Norther. I've seen these. They're killers. Henrik checked his cabin against the storm his ribs told him was coming. Wood stacked under cover, vestibule sealed against air infiltration, interior temperature holding at 54 degrees despite exterior cold that would drop further. The chamber's federal guard had been reduced to 2 soldiers the marshal reassigned to railroad violence farther south. Victor's absence from town suggested he was positioning pieces on a board only he could see completely. January 15th began with temperature inversions that fooled everyone into believing winter had relented. Morning started at 38 degrees and climbed steadily. By noon, Henrik measured 42 degrees on the porch thermometer, watching the ancient wall absorb solar radiation with the patience of stone that had learned thermal dynamics through centuries of desert seasons. He taught Emma the principles as they measured together. See how the stone holds heat, surface temperature reaching 68 degrees while air temperature stays 42. That 26-degree differential is stored energy that will release slowly tonight. 4 o'clock brought the first sign that nature hadn't relented, just inhaled before screaming. Temperature dropped 6 degrees in 30 minutes, the kind of plunge that announced atmospheric violence incoming. Wind shifted to northwest velocity, climbing from calm to 15 miles per hour to 25. By 6 o'clock, the mercury showed 12 degrees and falling. Wind sustained at 40 miles per hour with gusts that rattled shutters and tested every joint in every structure on the mesa. Inside Henrik's cabin, 58 degrees of carefully engineered warmth demonstrated that Diego's wisdom had translated perfectly into practice. Thomas's modified cabin achieved 42 degrees, cold enough that his breath fogged, but warm enough that survival didn't require heroism. Standard construction cabins across Stone Mesa told grimmer stories. Families burned wood frantically, while interior temperatures struggled to reach 32 degrees, children crying from cold that parents couldn't remedy despite desperate efforts. Victor's men attempting to reach the chamber through the storm's fury turned back before exposure could kill them. Nature had provided protection that federal marshals couldn't match. The first night passed in relative comfort for Henrik and Emma. 52 degrees at 3 in the morning, maintained with a single charge of properly seasoned wood in the stove vestibule, trapping heat with efficiency that made the difference between sleep and shivering endurance. Emma read Diego's journals by lamplight, learning about Pueblo engineering, while wind screamed outside walls too thick for its fury to penetrate. Thomas visited near midnight, walking 200 yards through 40 below wind chill to confirm what his body already knew. Your cabin works, 18 degrees warmer than mine. Diego's methods are real. The validation should have felt more satisfying than it did. The ancient ones knew. We're just relearning. Night 2 brought crisis that transformed theory into moral obligation. The knock came at 10 o'clock, Peterson pounding with fists already numb from cold. His youngest child, 2 years old, showed symptoms Henrik recognized from medical descriptions of hypothermia. Blue-tinged lips, shivering that had progressed to stillness, confusion that manifested as the toddler trying to remove clothes her body desperately needed. Their cabin registered 22 degrees on the thermometer. Thomas checked cold enough that survival became questionable for the very young and very old. Please, the baby is turning blue. Henrik's decision required no deliberation. Bring them in. The Peterson family arrived first, but word spread faster than winter wind. Maria appeared with her household. Sullivan's family followed. 3 more families crowded through the vestibule into space designed for 2 people. 23 bodies filling 112 square feet with the desperation of people who'd run out of other options. Interior temperature dropped to 44 degrees with the human traffic and door openings that thermal mass couldn't fully compensate for. But 44 degrees split the difference between life and death when exterior temperatures measured 5 below zero and falling. The Peterson baby, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by body heat in a cabin that maintained survivable warmth, slowly regained color that had drained toward gray. Her mother's tears needed no translation. Thank you. Thank you. You saved her. The siege lasted 7 days. Outdoor temperatures fluctuated between -5 and 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds sustained between 25 and 45 miles per hour, occasionally gusting higher during periods that forced everyone indoors regardless of cabin quality. Henrik's structure maintained between 44 and 48 degrees with 23 occupants, a testament to thermal engineering that Diego would have recognized as vindication. Other families abandoned cabins checked during brief lulls when the storm's intensity permitted outside movement, registered between 8 and 15 degrees interior temperature. Everything liquid had frozen solid. Walls showed frost patterns extending 4 feet from exterior surfaces. The structural sound of wood contracting in extreme cold resembled rifle shots in the darkness. Day 4 brought slight moderation, temperature climbing to 15 degrees, with wind dropping to 20 miles per hour. Henrik used the respite to teach rather than merely shelter. The demonstration repeated what he'd shown before the storm, but context transformed pedagogy into proof. Candle flame in gapped box versus sealed box. Adobe brick radiating stored heat hours after removal from sunlight. Vestibule principle demonstrated by temperature differential measurement across the double door system. Families took notes with pencil on whatever paper they'd brought. When the storm ends, we help you all modify your cabins. The promise bound community together in shared understanding that survival required learning from those who'd learned from the ancients. Thomas and Buck ventured out when conditions permitted, bringing supplies from abandoned cabins to the shelter that had become Stone Mesa's survival center. The social dynamics of 23 people in 112 square feet should have bred conflict, but shared crisis produced cooperation that prosperity had never managed. Children played quietly in corners. Adults rotated cooking duties. Everyone understood that Henrik's generosity had purchased their lives. Even families who'd supported the railroad found themselves rethinking positions. Victor's promises of jobs and prosperity meant nothing when your children froze in cabins that couldn't maintain 25 degrees during storms that lasted a week. Day 6, January 20th, brought Victor's final play. With most of town sheltered in Henrik's cabin, with the storm providing cover, and distraction with federal guards reduced to 2 half-frozen soldiers, the opportunity aligned perfectly for theft disguised as salvage. Emma had drawn the watch rotation that put her at the cabin's south window at 8 in the evening. Movement near the chamber entrance caught her attention, shapes moving with purpose through snow and darkness. She recognized Victor's silhouette before confirming identity mattered. Daddy, Mr. Hartwell, is in the chamber. He's taking everything. The tactical problem assembled itself instantly. Leaving the crowded cabin meant exposing everyone to cold that would kill the Peterson baby within an hour. Staying meant surrendering Diego's legacy to theft that would erase evidence of land ownership and historical significance both. Buck's voice cut through internal debate. I'll go. Thomas stood without discussion. Me too. Maria's addition surprised no one who knew her history. Then we all go. Everyone who can fight. 8 adults braved -2 degrees and 35-mile-per-hour wind, the 200-yard distance to the chamber feeling like miles. Victor's men had overpowered the guards through numbers and surprised neither soldier seriously injured, but both disarmed and restrained. The chamber itself blazed with lamplight, Victor directing the loading of artifacts and scrolls into wagons that would never reach their destination if Elena's documentation and Henrik's copies meant anything. Get out. This treasure is mine. My father searched 30 years. The counter-argument came between gasps of breath that froze instantly into clouds. Your father tried to destroy knowledge to profit from ignorance. The fight in blizzard conditions tested endurance more than skill. Victor's men, dressed for rapid action rather than sustained cold, lost effectiveness as exposure sapped strength. Buck's blacksmith power proved decisive in close quarters. Thomas fought with the fury of a man redeeming months of moral compromise. Henrik, broken ribs, screaming protest, protected the chamber entrance against men whose motivation came from wages rather than conviction. But one wagon broke free, driver whipping horses into motion before anyone could prevent departure. The load included the stone tablet, heaviest and most valuable piece, thousands of pounds of carved basalt, documenting knowledge that couldn't be replaced if destroyed. The wagon's course toward the mesa's edge followed desperation rather than planning, drivers seeking escape rather than destination. When the rear wheel hit buried stone and the load shifted, physics took over from intention. The wagon tipped with the slow majesty of large objects succumbing to gravity's absolute authority. The stone tablet slid toward the cliff edge 200 feet above the canyon floor. Emma, who disobeyed explicit orders to stay in the cabin, ran forward with the reflexes of someone too young to properly calculate risk. The tablet. Her hands found the carved surface, 9-year-old strength, impossibly insufficient to halt momentum on ice-covered ground. Her feet slipped. Both child and tablet began sliding toward emptiness. Henrik's dive came from instinct that bypassed conscious thought. His arms wrapped Emma's waist even as his own momentum carried them both toward the edge. Thomas grabbed Henrik's leg. Buck grabbed Thomas. The human chain arrested motion 3 feet from the precipice, knuckles white with grip strength that transcended cold and fear. They pulled backward in synchronized heaving, dragging Emma and Tablet away from the edge, away from the drop that would have ended everything. Emma sobbed into Henrik's chest while the stone tablet rested secure, its knowledge preserved through luck and desperation in roughly equal measure. Victor's rage at failure manifested as a charge toward Henrik. That ice turned into tragedy. His feet lost purchase. The fall broke his leg with a compound fracture that produced screaming audible over wind. His men surrendered immediately, cold, an injury stripping away whatever loyalty wages had purchased. Federal custody meant imprisonment for Victor and his accomplices, charges ranging from theft of protected artifacts to assault on federal guards to destruction of evidence. The marshal returned from his railroad violence investigation, arrived to find the case solved and the criminals gift-wrapped. Everything returned to the chamber, suffered no permanent damage beyond Victor's failed theft. The storm broke on January 22nd, 7 days after its arrival, temperature climbing to 18 degrees and wind calming to manageable levels. Sun emerged with the kind of brilliance that follows extended darkness, light bouncing off snow until the world seemed constructed of glare. The count showed 15 families on Stone Mesa. All survived. 0 deaths, 0 serious injuries beyond Victor's self-inflicted compound fracture and Henrik's cracked ribs that had started healing before the storm began. Standard construction cabins had burned through 60 to 70% of winter wood supplies. Henrik's cabin had consumed 35%. The efficiency difference represented margin between survival and crisis, between comfort and catastrophe. Proof didn't require argument anymore. Every family had measured the temperature differential, felt the difference between cabins that worked with nature and cabins that fought it. Thomas's modified structure performed well enough that 3 other families requested similar improvements. Buck's blacksmithing skills found new application in producing hardware for vestibules and stovepipe systems. The community gathered at Henrik's cabin on January 23rd, all 15 families somehow fitting into and around a structure designed for one family, but engineered to welcome 23 during crisis. The spokesperson, a man who'd supported Hartwell until the storm taught him the value of wisdom over promises, delivered apology and request in equal measure. "We were wrong. We owe you an apology, and we need your help. Teach us what Diego taught you." Henrik's response came without hesitation or triumph. "Diego's knowledge belongs to everyone. Of course I'll teach you." The building campaign began February 1st. Henrik designed modifications for each cabin based on specific orientation, exposure, and structural limitations. Week 1 saw every structure receiving mudlime chinking temperature improvements averaging 10 degrees. Week 2 added interior plaster thermal mass that buffered temperature swings and provided another 6 degrees of warming. Week 3 brought vestibules to 10 families willing to invest labor in permanent improvement. The transformation extended beyond temperature. Thomas became Henrik's lead carpenter, his skills enhanced by understanding principles rather than merely following instructions. Mary's health improved in environments that maintained 42 degrees instead of 28, her coughing fits declining as her lungs no longer fought constant cold stress. By month's end, Stone Mesa had become a laboratory demonstrating that ancient wisdom could be translated into modern practice without losing essential principles. The cabins weren't perfect. Henrik's remained the warmest by significant margin, but every modified structure proved livable rather than merely survivable, comfortable rather than endured. Victor's trial proceeded in federal court, the charges too serious for territorial jurisdiction to claim authority. His father, facing accessory charges for planning the sabotage, testified against his son with the desperation of someone trying to reduce his own sentence. "I pushed Victor into this. The chamber obsession was mine. He just wanted to please me." The defense tried painting Victor as dutiful son, corrupted by paternal pressure, but the evidence documented independent decision-making and autonomous violence. The judge's verdict carried weight that territorial corruption couldn't undermine. Guilty on all charges. 5 years federal prison plus $25,000 fine. Victor's final words before sentencing echoed in the courtroom. I lost everything for old stones and paper. Henrik's response, delivered from the gallery where victims traditionally sat, corrected the fundamental misunderstanding. No, you lost everything because you valued gold over wisdom. The distinction mattered more than Victor would ever understand. The legal victory arrived with the replacement judge, a federal appointee from Washington, whose first act was reviewing the original hearing's transcript with attention that exposed corruption through careful analysis. The land-grant document underwent authentication by three separate historical experts, each confirming what Elena had known from initial examination. Spanish colonial records matched signatures. Paper stock dated correctly. Most critically, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo's preservation clause applied without ambiguity. This land belongs to the Pueblo people's descendants in designated heirs. Henrik Nordstrom, as Diego Chavez's legal heir, is recognized owner under federal treaty law. The chamber and all contents are protected under the Antiquities Act of 1906. The railroad's claim dissolved into irrelevance, dismissed with prejudice. Victor Hartwell began serving his 5-year federal sentence the week after the judge's ruling, his father Frank awaiting trial on conspiracy charges that would never reach court. The old man died in territorial prison 3 months later, pneumonia claiming what frontier hardship had already weakened. The priest who heard his final confession reported last words that arrived too late to matter. I wasted my life chasing stones. Tell Nordstrom he was right. The knowledge mattered more. Henrik received the message without triumph. What a waste measured itself in decades of destruction, opportunities for collaboration that pride and greed had prevented. Diego could have had a partner instead of an enemy. The territorial expansion had cost indigenous peoples their knowledge destroyed because conquerors couldn't imagine conquered populations possessed wisdom worth preserving. Tershera Chen returned to Stone Mesa in March with a proposal that transformed preservation into education. The Smithsonian wanted to study the chamber's contents, but their institutional understanding recognized that removing artifacts from context destroyed meaning as surely as Victor's theft would have. The proposal centered on creating a teaching facility on-site, partnering with the Smithsonian and the newly established University of New Mexico to train builders and architects in principles Diego had spent 40 years documenting. What about the gold? The question had practical weight. $5,000 represented wealth beyond Henrik's previous comprehension, enough to rebuild life in Denver or San Francisco, enough to give Emma advantages that Stone Mesa could never provide. Dr. Chen's answer came carefully measured. Legally yours, but I'd suggest investing it in the center. Make this a place where Diego's legacy lives forever. The decision came during a conversation with Emma herself, 10 years old now, and reading at levels that would challenge most adults. She'd been working through Diego's journals, translating Spanish passages with Maria's help, her notebook filling with observations about thermal dynamics that demonstrated comprehension beyond her years. Daddy, what are we going to do with the gold? We could sell it, move to a city, get you into a good school, give you the life your mother would have wanted. Emma's response came without hesitation. Mama would want us to do what's right. Diego gave us the gold to protect the knowledge. That means teaching people. The wisdom in her answer made the decision inevitable. The Stone Mesa Building Academy received its founding endowment that week, $5,000 of Spanish colonial gold, translated into American currency that purchased lumber tools and teaching materials. The federal government matched the contribution with $10,000, recognizing historical value. The Smithsonian added $5,000 for research access. $20,000 total represented wealth that transformed the Mesa's future. The mission statement, drafted by Henrik and refined by Elena's editorial precision, centered on teaching traditional building methods while preserving ancient knowledge. First students would be families who'd survived the Blue Norther, their tuition paid through labor on academy construction. Future students would come from across the territory, bringing their own traditions to learn from Pueblo wisdom that had preceded them by centuries. Thomas became the first official instructor before academy buildings existed, teaching chinking and plaster techniques to neighbors whose cabins still needed modification. His transformation from saboteur to educator carried moral weight students recognize. Buck's blacksmithing program started in his existing shop, metalwork principles applied to stove systems and structural hardware that improved thermal performance. Maria taught history. Most textbooks ignored the story of Spanish and Pueblo collaboration that had produced engineering knowledge both cultures could claim as heritage. April brought the first formal class, 30 students from across New Mexico territory, paying tuition through work on academy buildings or through territorial stipends for promising young craftsmen. The curriculum balanced theory with practice. Thermal mass principles taught in morning lectures found application in afternoon construction projects. Wind dynamics lessons preceded hands-on vestibule building. Sustainable design concepts translated into actual structures rising on the mesa. Henrik discovered that teaching required different skills than building, explaining why thermal mass work demanded understanding that went deeper than simply knowing it functioned. Students asked questions Diego would have answered instantly, forcing Henrik to research principles he'd accepted on faith. The education went both ways, teacher learning through necessity of teaching. Emma's role emerged organically from her presence during lessons. She'd been helping Henrik since the cabin's construction, her observations often sharper than adult analysis because she approached problems without preconceptions about what solutions should look like. When children visited the academy with their families, Emma became their guide, translating complex engineering into stories that 9 and 10-year-olds could comprehend. The chamber tours she conducted mixed history with adventure. My daddy and I opened this using clues Diego left in his journals. Each step of building the cabin revealed the next puzzle piece. The narrative structure engaged children in ways technical lectures couldn't match, transforming architectural education into treasure hunt mythology that stuck in young minds. Elena recognized the teaching approach's value immediately. Emma, you should write this down. Your story could help other children understand why these buildings matter. The book began as a school assignment, Emma's account of discovering Diego's inheritance and solving the three-lock puzzle. But the writing revealed talent that transcended age, a narrative voice that balanced technical accuracy with emotional honesty. Elena's editing refined the prose without diminishing Emma's perspective. Maria contributed historical context. Henrik provided architectural diagrams. By summer's end, the manuscript nearing completion carried the title Emma had chosen, The House Diego Built, a Treasure Hunt in Stone. Stone Mesa's transformation accelerated beyond physical structures. Population grew from 12 families to 45 within the academy's first year. Students needed housing, food supplies. The general store expanded. Boarding houses opened. A restaurant began serving meals that accommodated dietary traditions from Mexican to Native American to European immigrant cuisines. The economy that Victor had promised through railroad construction materialized through education instead. The town's attitude toward Henrik shifted from mockery through grudging respect into something approaching reverence that made him uncomfortable. He'd come broke and desperate, expecting to find worthless ruins. Instead, he'd become the unlikely patriarch of a community built on knowledge that predated American territorial claims by centuries. September 1890 brought the Academy's official dedication, the one-year anniversary of Henrik's inheritance, transformed into celebration of what that inheritance had become. The territorial governor made the journey to Stone Mesa, his presence lending political weight to an institution that had grown faster than anyone anticipated. 200 people attended ceremonies that mixed formality with frontier practicality, speeches delivered from hastily constructed podiums, to audiences that included everyone from university professors to students who'd arrived literate only in construction techniques they now understood mathematically. The new buildings demonstrated every principle the Academy taught. Classrooms oriented south-southeast to maximize winter solar gain. Dormitories incorporated thermal mass walls that moderated temperature swings. Workshops featured natural ventilation systems that eliminated need for mechanical air movement. Every structure functioned as teaching tool and practical shelter, simultaneously beauty, body, and utility integrated through design that refused to separate aesthetics from performance. Morning brought final preparations. Henrik walked through the academy grounds, seeing Diego's vision made manifest in structures that would stand for generations. Emma had been exploring near the chamber since dawn, her natural curiosity leading her to examine details adults had stopped noticing through familiarity. Daddy, she ran toward him with the urgency of discovery. Behind Diego's statue, the stones don't match. The observation proved accurate upon examination. Behind where the bronze statue would be unveiled, stone patterns showed discontinuity that trained eyes recognized as significant. Diego had placed these stones recently, possibly during his final months when lung fever had already begun claiming his strength. The carved symbol matched a journal entry Henrik had read but not understood, cryptic reference to final truth revealed when first students succeed. They removed the stones with archaeological care, revealing an alcove barely large enough to hold what Diego had hidden there. The letter inside bore Henrik's name in handwriting that trembled with illness, but maintained Diego's characteristic precision. Should we read it now? Emma's excitement battled with understanding that this moment might matter more than personal curiosity. Later, during the ceremony, this is for everyone. The dedication began at noon. September sun, warming the crowd gathered before the Academy's main building. The governor's speech hit themes that territorial politics demanded. This academy represents the best of our territory, honoring the past while building the future. The Pueblo people's wisdom preserved by Diego Chavez, taught by Henrik Nordstrom. This is how civilization advances, learning from all our people. Dr. Chen's Smithsonian perspective added scientific validation. In 1 year, we've documented building techniques that were nearly lost. Over 50 students trained, now building better homes across the territory. The knowledge in that chamber will influence architecture for generations. Maria spoke with voice that carried across the crowd with strength that 70 years hadn't diminished. My husband Diego spent his life protecting this place. He died believing his work would be lost. Henrik proved him wrong. Diego, wherever you are, your legacy lives. Your wisdom is being shared. Henrik's turn at the podium came with reluctance that bordered on resistance. Public speaking had never come naturally, and attention focused on him felt misplaced when Diego deserved credit for everything that mattered. But the crowd waited with expectation that couldn't be denied. I came here, broke, desperate, with a daughter to feed. I inherited old stones and thought they were worthless. Diego knew better. The admission cost pride he'd already surrendered through necessity. He taught me the old ways aren't obsolete. They're essential. Thermal mass, natural ventilation, building with a climate instead of against it. These aren't primitive methods. They're wisdom we forgot and need to remember. He paused, seeing faces in the crowd that represented Diego's true legacy. Thomas, who transformed from saboteur to teacher. Buck, whose metalwork enhanced every building on the mesa. Elena, whose documentation ensured the knowledge would survive. Maria, whose partnership with Diego had spanned 40 years. Emma, who would carry the quest forward into generations Henrik wouldn't live to see. This academy will teach thousands over coming decades, but it started with one man's vision and trust that knowledge would find the right air. This is Diego's house. We're just keeping it warm. The phrase resonated because it captured truth that transcended metaphor. Every building on the mesa existed because Diego had preserved knowledge that others had tried to destroy. Henrik and his students merely maintained the fire Diego had kindled. The statue's unveiling revealed bronze work that Buck's metalworking students had cast under his supervision. Diego Chavez stood 8 feet tall on a granite base, architectural plans, held in hands that had drafted buildings designed to last centuries. The inscription avoided hagiography for simple accuracy. Diego Chavez, 1816 to 1888, guardian of the ancient ways, teacher of the future. Maria's tears when she touched the bronze spoke to 40 years of partnership with a man whose genius had been recognized too late for him to know. Mi amor, you would be so proud. The crowd began dispersing toward tables laden with food when Henrik raised his hand for attention. One more thing, Diego left us something, found this morning behind the statue. He held up the letter, its yellowed paper visible to everyone. Emma stood beside him as he broke the seal and began reading aloud, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. If you're reading this, you succeeded. You opened the chamber, taught the people, built the academy. I knew you could. You were always my best student. Henrik's throat tightened, but he continued. But there's one more thing you should know. The chamber we found, it's not the only one. Gasps rippled through the audience. Henrik read on, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what Diego was revealing. The Pueblo people built a network, 12 chambers across New Mexico, each with different knowledge. I found 3 others, never opened them. I'm too old. The crowd pressed closer, every person understanding they were witnessing history's expansion beyond what anyone had imagined. That's your quest now, Hijo. Find them, open them, share what's inside. The map is in the final scroll. the one I never showed anyone. Coordinates for all 12 chambers. Henrik looked up from the letter, meeting Emma's eyes before addressing the crowd. Diego's final instruction was this: "This is your legacy, not one chamber, but a lifetime of discovery. Teach Emma. Let her help. The next generation needs to carry this forward. Build well, Henrik. Build with love. Build forever." The silence that followed held weight that mere noise could never achieve. Then Buck Sullivan's voice broke it. 12 chambers. Sweet mercy. The knowledge we've got here is just the beginning. Thomas stepped forward. "Where's the map?" Henrik gestured toward the chamber. Diego said, "The final scroll, hidden in the deepest alcove. We need to retrieve it." The procession that walked to the chamber included everyone from the dedication ceremony, 200 people moving with the gravity of pilgrims approaching sacred ground. Inside the chamber, Henrik located the alcove Diego had described, finding the scroll hidden behind artifacts that hadn't been moved during any previous examination. The map unrolled across the stone tablet they'd nearly lost to Victor's theft. New Mexico territory marked with 12 locations, each symbol indicating different knowledge domains. Water near the Rio Grande, fire in volcanic regions, earth in mountain zones, air at high elevations, life in valleys, death in desert spaces. Each chamber holds specialized understanding accumulated over generations. Henrik traced the locations with his finger, seeing decades of work stretching before him, preserved against the destruction that conquest had intended but not completed. Dr. Chen's voice carried professional excitement barely contained. "This is unprecedented. A continental knowledge system, pre-Columbian engineering documented and preserved across an entire territory." Maria's question voiced what others were thinking. Did Diego visit all 12? She answered her own query carefully. "I suspected. He took trips every year, came back with journals he wouldn't show me. I think he was checking on them, making sure they stayed sealed." The governor cleared his throat, political instincts recognizing opportunity. "The territory will fund expeditions. This knowledge belongs to everyone, and New Mexico will ensure it's discovered and protected." But Henrik was looking at Emma, seeing her eyes bright with the same excitement he'd felt when first discovering Diego's puzzle. "This is your inheritance too. When you're older, you'll lead expeditions." Emma's response came with certainty that presumed futures worth building. "And I'll teach my children." The crowd remained at the chamber until sunset, discussing the 12 chambers, planning expeditions, imagining what knowledge each location might hold. When they finally dispersed, it was with understanding that the dedication ceremony had revealed something larger than anyone anticipated. Diego's legacy extended beyond Stone Mesa, beyond one chamber, beyond one man's lifetime. It was a gift to generations that would measure time in centuries rather than years. That evening, Henrik and Emma stood before Diego's statue under stars that blazed with clarity, possible only in high desert darkness. The bronze figure seemed to watch over them with eternal patience, guardian whose duty extended beyond death into whatever time remained. Emma carried her notebook, pages filled with sketches and calculations and narrative fragments that would become the book teaching children that ancient wisdom could be translated into modern understanding. "Do you think Diego knows what we did?" The question assumed consciousness persisted beyond death. A belief Henrik couldn't confirm but chose to accept. "I think he always knew. That's why he chose us." She showed him the title page she'd been refining through countless revisions. "The House That Taught Us How to Live." Henrik tested the words, feeling their weight. Perfect, because that's exactly what it did. They stood in companionable silence, looking at academy buildings spread across the mesa, lights glowing in windows designed to maximize solar gain. Families gathered in dormitories that maintained warmth through principles the ancient ones had understood. Knowledge flowing between generations, teachers learning from students who brought traditions from pueblos and haciendas and frontier settlements scattered across territories that ignored cultural heritage in favor of arbitrary boundaries. Next summer, we start looking for the second chamber. The quest Diego had bequeathed couldn't be completed in one lifetime, but that made it appropriate for someone who understood that wisdom accumulated across generations rather than emerging fully formed from individual genius. Next summer, but tonight we celebrate what we've already found. December brought winter's return, the anniversary of the Blue Norther that had proved everything. This storm lacked its predecessor's violence, but carried enough cold and wind to test every structure against standards that had killed people the previous year. Temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Wind sustained at 30 miles per hour. Every modified cabin maintained interior warmth above 40 degrees. The academy buildings achieved 52, 54 degrees despite housing 75 students who continued their studies while snow accumulated outside walls too thick for cold to penetrate. The contrast between this December and the last measured survival against comfort, crisis against inconvenience. Children who'd nearly frozen 12 months prior now played games in dormitory common rooms. Families who'd burned through winter supplies, maintaining barely survivable temperatures, now use 40% less fuel while achieving conditions that permitted normal life rather than mere endurance. The community gathering on December 20th filled the Academy's Great Hall, 300 people representing the original 15 Stone Mesa families, plus students and staff, and visitors who'd come to witness what education could accomplish when it married tradition with innovation. Thomas stood to offer a toast, his role as head instructor, giving him authority that a year previous he couldn't have imagined possessing. 2 years ago, I was hired to sabotage Henrik's work. I was desperate. My wife was dying. I needed money. Mary sat beside him, healthy, and holding their youngest child, living proof that choices mattered more than circumstances. Henrik offered me something better than money purpose. He taught me to build with integrity. The glass raised toward Henrik carried gratitude that encompassed everyone Diego's wisdom had touched, through Henrik's willingness to share rather than hoard. To Henrik Nordstrom, who saved us all, not just from the storm, from ourselves. Henrik's response redirected credit where it belonged. I didn't save anyone. Diego did. He preserved knowledge when others wanted it destroyed. He trusted me to share it. Now it belongs to all of you. Build well, teach others, pass it forward. That's how wisdom survives. The principle mattered more than the practice, the idea that knowledge gained value through distribution rather than hoarding. Every student who graduated from the academy carried Diego's legacy to new communities, new territories, new generations who would benefit from understanding that buildings could work with nature instead of fighting, losing battles against forces that always won eventually. Late evening found Henrik and Emma walking through snow that reflected moonlight into landscapes of silver and shadow. They stopped at Diego's grave marker, placed on academy grounds, so students would know whose vision they inherited. Emma pulled her finished manuscript from beneath her coat pages, bound with ribbon Maria had provided. I'm dedicating it to Diego, and to Mama, and to you. Henrik's eyes burned with something that wasn't entirely cold wind. They'd be proud. I'm proud. They stood together in the silence that followed, father and daughter looking toward futures neither could fully imagine, but both trusted would honor the past that had brought them here. The 12 chambers waited across New Mexico territory, holding knowledge that would take decades to discover and centuries to fully understand. Emma would lead those expeditions, someday would open doors Diego had found, but chosen to leave sealed would carry forward the quest that had begun 40 years before her birth. But tonight, in the warmth of buildings constructed with ancient wisdom and modern dedication, in the company of people who'd learned that survival required cooperation, rather than competition, in the legacy of a man who'd spent his life protecting what others would have destroyed, Henrik Nordstrom had everything that mattered. The stones remembered heat, the walls remembered shelter, the chambers remembered knowledge. And people who built with understanding, rather than merely following instructions, created homes that taught their occupants how to live. The epilogue wrote itself in lights glowing across Stone Mesa, in students studying principles that had survived centuries of deliberate destruction, in families gathering around hearths that burned with efficiency, born from wisdom rather than waste. The Stone Mesa Building Academy would operate until 1952, training over 4,000 builders who carried Diego's teachings across territories that would become states. Henrik and Emma would discover 8 of the 12 chambers over the next 20 years, each expedition revealing knowledge that influenced architecture globally. But the true legacy measured itself not in buildings or discoveries, or even in knowledge preserved. It measured itself in the principle that some truths never aged, some wisdom never grew obsolete, some understanding remained essential regardless of how many years separated its discovery from its application. The ancient ones had known how to shelter human vulnerability against nature's indifference. They documented that knowledge in stone and adobe and careful observations spanning generations. Diego had protected it, Henrik had shared it. Emma would expand it. And in every cabin where families slept warm, despite winter's fury, in every structure that worked with climate, instead of fighting it, in every student who learned that innovation sometimes meant recovering what had been deliberately forgotten, the inheritance continued. Knowledge once shared lived forever. The final image held on Stone Mesa at twilight snow, fresh from recent storm transforming landscape into possibility. Smoke rose from chimneys, from structures old and new, that shared commitment to principles that transcended time. Diego's bronze statue stood eternal watch over the chamber entrance, guardian of wisdom that had survived because someone chose to share rather than hoard. Henrik and Emma turned toward the warmth of the great hall, toward the community that had been forged through shared crisis and sustained through shared understanding, toward the future that stretched before them with the promise of discoveries yet to come. Behind them, the ancient ruins stood, patient and proud walls that had sheltered knowledge across centuries, finally recognized for the treasure they had always been. Some legacies measured themselves in gold. Others measured themselves in wisdom. Diego Chavez had left both, but only one truly mattered: the choice to protect knowledge over wealth, to share understanding over hoarding secrets, to teach rather than merely possess. These were the inheritances that transformed poverty into purpose, ruins into revelation, and one man's desperate inheritance into a gift that would warm lives for generations yet unborn. The door to the great hall closed behind them, but the light it held spilled out into darkness. Beacon and promise, both proving that even the coldest night could be overcome by wisdom applied with love, by knowledge shared with generosity, by buildings constructed not merely to shelter bodies, but to teach souls how warmth was created and sustained and passed forward through time.